everyone, and welcome to Open Caucus. Today we're focusing on women and girls in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, is what the acronym stands for. I'm Art Eggleton, Senator from Toronto, and beside me is my co-chair, Senator Ramona Germain from Quebec. The Open Caucus is a forum for discussion on issues of national importance. This meeting is co-sponsored by the Independent Senators Group, ISG, the Independent Senate Liberals, and for the first time, the Government Representative Office in the Senate. Senator Harder, Senator Mitchell, and Senator Belmar have now joined our sponsorship team, and I hope one of them is going to come in here before long so we can recognize them. So this is a non-partisan discussion, as always, and it's open to all parliamentarians. I should note that Elizabeth May is here, and if there's any other MPs that come along, they should join us at the table as well. So parliamentarians, staff, media, and the public. Now, women and girls in STEM fields continue to be underrepresented in Canada. While some progress has occurred, it's been very slow. In 1987, think of how long ago that was, 20% of people working in STEM were female compared to 22% today. Very slow pace of progress. Women working in STEM fields disproportionately end up also in lower paying technical roles rather than the higher paid professional ones, earning only 82% of what the men do. STEM-related knowledge and skills, both for men and women, are increasingly in demand in the global economy, paying higher incomes relevant to other occupations. With the persistent underrepresentation of women, it'll be difficult to close or narrow the overall gender wage gap. In recognition of the International Day of Women and Girls in Science, which is coming up on February 11th, today we will explore what deters or prevents women and girls from studying and entering STEM fields, and what can Canada do to ensure women and girls are given equal opportunities in scientific careers. Now, logistically, let me say a couple things. One, coffee and tea are available at the back of the room. Secondly, translation. I particularly speak to our audience on this one. Use headsets located on your chair. Channel 1 is for English, Channel 2 is for French. Now, we also encourage audience participation. So if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, we can give you up to 3 minutes. Let our Open Caucus coordinator know, and that's Sarah. Sarah, wave. There's Sarah. So you just let Sarah know, and she gets your name and any affiliation you have, and brings it up to Raymond and I. And so again, I want to also welcome MPs. I only see one so far, Elizabeth May, but I've told some others may be coming. So with that, let me turn to my co-chair, Senator Raymond Saint-Germain.
Thank you, co-chair. Bienvenue, collègues. Bienvenue.
Welcome, colleagues. Welcome, Ms. May, and welcome to the audience. My colleague, the Honourable Senator Eggleton, alluded very elegantly to the underrepresentation of women in the field of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In her conference in Montreal last Monday evening, Michelle Obama said, "If you see a table and everyone sitting around it are from the same race and the same gender, ask questions." Unfortunately, in the case before us today, there are still too many questions that need to be asked. Our panelists will have an opportunity to raise some of these questions and hopefully supply some answers. But let's be clear, Canada will be more competitive and innovative if we encourage women to study and pursue STEM careers. I'm very proud to sit beside women in the Senate who are scientists and engineers, and I think of Senator Motion, who is now here, who was in charge of an an international financial cooperative, these women can inspire our young girls. That being said, we must note that the wonderful progress that we were expecting to see has still not happened. We know that we must do more than simply pay lip service. Numerous efforts have been made through public policies, but are we going in the right direction? And if not, what do we need to do? So I'm hoping that we'll have good questions and answers this morning that will help us. Thank you.
From our panelists, we do have one panelist who is on her way by flight, which is always problematic in the wintertime, so I hope she'll be here before long, Beata Caranci. We will start with our first panelist, who is Dr. Ismail Morafi. He's an assistant professor at the University of Toronto and a member of the Early Childhood Interventions Network at the University of Chicago. His research is focused on microeconomics. Dr. Morafi's recent research project examines why women are underrepresented in STEM education and careers and is looking at what policies would help change the situation in STEM fields and potentially reduce the wage-gender gap. So that's very appropriate for our discussion this morning. Dr. Morafi, please.
Bonjour à tous, c'est vraiment merci.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you for your invitation.
About this important issue, which is the underrepresentation of women in STEM, which stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I will be very direct. I will try first to give some of the reasons that lead to this underrepresentation, and then I will try to propose some type of direction that may help us to try to increase the enrollment of young girls in the STEM. So usually when we heard STEM, we have in mind science, technology, engineering, mathematics. All those things are really related to math. There is some math intensity in that field. But in STEM, there are also some fields where we do not have that much level of math. If you look at in the science labeling, we have social science, we have sociology, we have psychology, we have life science. And those fields, usually the women are not so underrepresented. But those are not the fields that we have in mind when we say that STEM. So what I will do as an experiment, I will remove those fields where we do not have math intensity there to see what are really the representation of the woman in those fields that are really math intensive. If you look at the next slide, the slide that we have, you see, if you take the STEM as a whole, we have around 17% of women in the STEM. But as soon as I focus on the math intensive, we have around only 6% of women who decide to go in the math intensive STEM, which is this rate is very alarming and is very low, actually, compared to the men, which is around 28% in that field. So the question is why we have this very low representation of women in all the fields that are in general math intensive. I'm going to take the eyes as economists to see in economics literature there have been two main reasons that people discuss about this underrepresentation. One is what we call the monetary reason. So what we call by this is if the young girls observe that currently we have wage discrimination on the workplace dominated by women, their expectation in being wage discriminating in the future also going to affect their decision in going to STEM. Okay, this is one of the first reasons. The second reason is what I'm going to call the non-pecuniary reason. Those are all the reasons that are not really related to earnings. It's not an income maximizer. They are not income maximizer, but in general affect a lot the decision of girls in going in STEM. And in a recent study with my team, we show that the recent graduates in Canada tend to be more affected by the non-pecuniary reason. So what are those non-pecuniary reasons? The first one that I'm going to cite is the math anxiety, okay, which is going to be in some sense related to the second one that I'm going to call the gender stereotype. And the third one that are going to label the lack of female role model in all the level of education. So let's discuss about the math anxiety for a minute. So the math anxiety has been shown to affect more young girls in all the country, particularly in developed country. Okay? So the math anxiety is not a lack of ability, but it's just something that affects young girls that they are not able to perform in their full performance when they are doing math. They try to avoid math and they fear about mathematics. Okay? So why they fear about that is because in our society we may have too much gender stereotype, okay, in the society. If, for example, a recent study showed that just by the second grade, boys and girls tend to associate everything about math to only male. And this gender stereotype affect a lot our younger girls from the beginning. And when they got affected so early, they tend to avoid math along of their career. So when they reach the choice and high school decision, they may decide to go in other fields that are not math intensive. Okay? Something is interesting is if you look at this next graph, we ask this question to this young girl, do the job that we have, this is what you are hoping for. And in general, you will see that women tend to say that the job that they have are the job that they were hoping for, even if those jobs are not in STEM. So where those preferences are coming from, actually? So those preferences are coming from the fact that since the earlier age, we affect their perception of the fields of STEM, okay? And we put them in one direction that the math and the STEM are not necessarily for the girls. So what to do to fight against this? There has been many policy that has been discussed in the literature. One is the general fight against the wage discrimination, and first, pay equity laws. Those policies are very good, but the difficulty is they may happen too late. Because if they do not choose the STEM at the very early age, when they're going to reach this level, this will not affect them at the end. So what we propose to start at a very early age, to affect our girls at the very early age. And how? We should invest much more in the teacher professional development in mathematics. One very interesting statistic in Canada is 84% of our elementary teachers are women. If those women are very comfortable in teaching math, what is going to affect? This is going to affect the perception and change the perception of the girls that mathematics can be something suitable also for the women. And then they're going to develop internally some love for mathematics. And this is going to help them to avoid, to go more for the maths, okay, since the earlier age and increase their performance in mathematics. The second thing is more intervention at the earlier age in anything which is concerned about STEM. We have at the earlier age provide more role model to the young girls to say that there have been lots of good women who decide to have a career in engineering and they were very successful. We have to present this to our girls at the very early age of their career at the elementary school. One important point is to sensitize the parents, okay, about the gender stereotype, because some studies show that the perception of the parents affect a lot the view of the young girls about the decision of going in STEM or not STEM, okay? And I will try to finish by the last. We have to change our belief as teacher, kids, and parents about the perception that we have about STEM and avoid to associate STEM just to the math field, the main field. The second thing is we have to develop what I'm going to call the growth mindset, because for a long time people thought that mathematics is something innate. But this is not true. It's something that requires effort, and if both girls and boys are making effort, they will be able to have a good knowledge in mathematics, and this will help them to choose, to get into the field like the STEM. Thank you very much for your time.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. The questions will be asked later. Our second panelist is Ms. Anjali Agarwal. She is a professor and associate chair of electrical and computer engineering at Concordia University in Montreal. Before joining the faculty in 2009, she worked for 3 years in telecommunications. Ms. Agarwal has established a committee which tries to recruit and retain girls in STEM. Their efforts include the creation of new opportunities for women, and these new opportunities give young girls an opportunity to have an overview of what goes on in this STEM. Senator Algavis is also an engineer. Dr. Agarwal also received a PhD from Concordia. So we're very pleased to hear from you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation, and I'm very glad to be present here to present my views on women in engineering. So specifically, I'll be talking on engineering because I'm an engineer and I'm a professor in engineering. So the reason for me to become an engineer, that was the decision I made in 1979, was basically my brother was an engineer and I liked math and I liked science, and I thought if he can do it, I can do it too. It's not a big thing. So, so I jumped into engineering, and I really liked that area because of that. So what was happening in 1979 at that time? And I'm from India originally. I graduated from India. So at that time, out of 350 students in my whole group of engineering, we were only 18 female students. So that's about only 5% of engineering at that time. So what has changed since then? In India, a lot of change is there. It's basically now about 33% of female students are in engineering and technology. And if you see other countries also, other North African countries, other Southeast Asian countries, other Middle Eastern countries, there's still a lot of women are going in engineering. So the data that I collected from different sources on the internet, about 35 to 37, 40% are women in engineering. And but in North American countries, US, Canada, in developed countries like ours, we only have about 17% or 20% women engineers. So this is not the reason, because there the gender equality is not there as much as what we think in Canada. We have the gender equality is there, and there is no extra funding source of extra effort that they do in order to promote engineering over there. So what's the reason? So basically, if here I'm going to present the Canadian perspective of how much is the enrollment. So women, as the senator mentioned, it's about only 20% of total enrollment in our engineering program, which are accredited. So there is, of course, so much research initiatives, so many meetings are there, so many different camps are held, but still there is underrepresentation of women in engineering. And out of that 20%, only 13% of these women are professional engineers. Professional engineers meaning they register as a professional engineer and they work as professional engineers. But that's not a big question in my mind, because the big question is that they should be enrolled in engineering, they should be graduated as engineers. And then later on working as professional engineers is another topic. So our main goal is to increase this representation of women in engineering by 2030, about 30%. So that's the Engineers Canada initiative. So I'm from Concordia, so I'm going to give you an example of what's happening in Concordia. So in Concordia, about 20%, of course, same range as what we have in overall Canada. So about 20% of female students are registered. So if you notice in the beginning, around year 2000, there were more, but then they started to decline. And then again, now it's going up, maybe just 1%, 2% in the last 5 or 6 years. So it's not a very, the increase is not as much. And the ratio of graduation is also similar. So there are two things that we have to keep in mind. One is to attract the female students, and second thing is to retain them. Once they have entered into this profession, then we have to retain them. We have to keep them interested in keep on going in that area. So attracting women engineers. Okay. So what is generally, as my colleague over here mentioned, the image of engineering is basically technical, right? So they think engineering is mostly technical. It's into the technology. It's bridges, construction, this and that. Math is of course there, but there is other image that it's male oriented. So starting from the childhood age. And of course, it involves a lot of problem-solving skills. For example, you might have to design an aeroplane, and the wings, there are so much icing is there, especially in these countries. So how do we de-ice them? How do we define the assembly line, manufacturing thing? So we reduce the extra scrap is there, so reduce the downtime of our manufacturing plant. So there are some optimization, other aspects are there in problem-solving skills. So that's the image that our girls have in mind. It's mostly design, mostly problem solving, mostly only bridges. So those kind of images there. But we have to change this image. This image, we have to promote a new image. The new image is on not only into technology, it's also social skills now. Okay, so social skills are very important there. Social skills, for example, same example if I give, if there's a manufacturing line, we have to change things, how things are working over there. We have to discuss with the project management. We have to discuss with the different vendors, different contractors, what are the different products that are available. So you need to know the engineering aspect, and also you need to know the social aspects. So that's what our accreditation, our CAB is the accreditation body. They are promoting soft skills. So they are promoting the engineers to learn all those skills in order to be better engineers, and also relate to business side of engineering. So the customer requirements, all those things are fitting into that model of social skills. So this is not just for females, it's also for male, right? So it's to be shared among not only females, also the male, it's for everyone to learn both of these skills. So the future engineers, the would-be engineers that I promote should share this both aspects of technical aspects and also social skills aspects. So in other countries, as I mentioned before, the ratio of the percentage of female engineers is very high as compared to Canada. So what's the reason over there? As was also mentioned before, it's mostly the economic reason. The wages is higher, and also that. And also the prestige issue is also there over there. So it's a prestige to be an engineer, it's prestige to be a lawyer, prestige to be a doctor, and so on. So we also have to promote that. So, and the career is secure, and the salaries are higher. So those things are there. And also the aspect of the parents. The parents try to initiate this mindset into the children from the beginning itself, in order to promote science and technology and engineering later on. So what we did in order to attract female students. So at Concordia, our initiative was to basically bring senior high school students, bring the CJEP students, bring high school students to the university to show them what engineering is. Okay. Usually the camps are organized, of course, in different areas, in different places, but we wanted to bring them to the university and promote and show, so that they can have a choice that they can make with respect to their careers. So in this program, in this summer camp that we had, we basically provided some hands-on engineering experience, labs that they did, team projects that they did, and all the spots were filled. So I was very happy to see that there is students are interested in this area. So they just wanted to know what engineering is about. So in this program, what type of projects we had? We had projects, of course, which are mostly engineering oriented. The bridge building, construction is there. but also other aspects, other applications of engineering. For example, medical applications of engineering is there, synthetic biology aspects of there, medical imaging is there, and cardiovascular fluid dynamics. So all those heart-related, there's so much involved in not just engineering, but other aspects too. And green energy, so solar powerhouse was there. So sustainable development, all those aspects of other engineering aspects are still there. So that was brought to the high school students, and I was very excited to see that they really liked the camp and they wanted to come back as every year if they would. So that was the attract engineers. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the other problem is to retain them. Once they are into engineering, we have to promote them, we have to keep them, and we have to have them graduate. So what should we do about that? So we need to have role models, we need to have mentoring, we need to have other supports, we need to show them industry where the career is there, where the female engineers are hired. So we should bring them and give them opportunities of internship, working in those industry, scholarships, anything that will promote them or keep them or motivate them to continue. So to have role models, like I'm a woman faculty in engineering in Concordia. So I'm just presenting you the statistics over there. We are only 14, 15, 16% of women faculty. So that's again another role model that we should promote, we should increase. So that's our also mandate in future to hire more women faculty such that, and also in administration, in other management roles, in leadership roles, to overall promote that. So my recommendation is, as was also brought forward before, that we have to promote this at the very early age, at the very early career. So the primary schools, elementary schools are very important because they have the mindset developed at that age. So, and at every stage of female career is there, and primary school, later on in secondary school, later on in CJEP, later on in university, industry, at every level there has to be collaboration involved. So projects should be initiated at the high school itself, at the elementary school itself. For example, robotics project, so they should see some engineering aspects, not just math, but also other engineering aspects at a very early career age. So thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much. You've, I'm sure, provoked a lot of questions that you'll get a little bit later, but that's a great presentation from both of you. Now I'm going to go over to this side of the table. Doug Caucus is a member of the Caucus and Anishinaabe Nation in Northern Ontario. He has, for over 25 years, been working for and advocating in behalf of Indigenous peoples in numerous private and public sector roles. His primary focus has been on developing and advancing programs in support of Indigenous youth. Now, for the past 5 years, he's been the senior advisor for the National InSTEM, which is Indigenous STEM, program in Actua. That's an organization. And as a senior advisor in that organization, he is the main point of contact for 37 university member programs on their local initiatives, Indigenous organization partnerships, Indigenous community relations, and in the development and delivery of STEM programs for Indigenous youth. So welcome, Doug Caucus.
Thank you. Bonjour, Magizian Nodam Nage Condition the Cast, Chimigwet Skitchmanatu, Mishomas Nogamis. Greetings. Thank you for the introductions. Greetings, senators, honorable members, and fellow panelists and guests. I'm honored to be given a few minutes to discuss this important topic of women and girls in STEM, more specifically, Indigenous women and girls. Before I begin, I'd like to take a moment and recognize the Algonquin people whose traditional territory these proceedings are taking place. I'd also like to acknowledge that I don't speak on behalf of all Indigenous peoples in Canada, but merely want to share my experience with you as I have come to understand them from my own perspective, my own context. And I also certainly can't speak directly for the experiences of women and girls in STEM, but I'll do my best to share with you my knowledge in these areas. As the introduction stated, I'm currently working for an organization here in Ottawa called Actua, but I'm based out of North Bay, fortunately, I'm able to work from home, which is a nice thing these days. ACTRA is a national Canadian charity that supports a growing network of 35 science, technology, engineering, and mathematics outreach organizations that are based at universities and colleges across Canada. Annually, we engage over 250,000 youth in 500 communities nationwide. Our focus of engagement of youth who are significantly underserved and underrepresented in STEM. We achieve this through 3 national programs specifically designed to engage annually 35,000 Indigenous youth, 10,000 girls in specialized girls programs, and 30,000 other youth at risk, new Canadians and youth facing significant social economic challenges. As was earlier stated, women represent under 25% of the STEM the current STEM workforce, and women only represent 27% of the Indigenous ICT workforce. From a social perspective, women still earn less than men, and the majority are single-parent women, which is even more prevalent in the Indigenous community. From an economic perspective, we are facing a major shortage in the STEM fields. From the Indigenous perspective, Canada is missing out on $27 billion annually because of an underutilized Indigenous workforce in Canada. In order to speak to this important topic of Indigenous women and girls in STEM, I feel that we cannot authentically have this discussion with first acknowledging 2 important points. One, women have always been and continue to be the cornerstone of Indigenous communities. 2, we cannot have an honest conversation about how to encourage more Indigenous women and girls to pursue education and careers in the STEM fields without first examining why they don't participate in the first place. We're not here today to solve all the historical or social, economic, or legal inequalities that have contributed to the underrepresentation of Indigenous women and girls in this sector. However, there are some key factors that do contribute to the overall representation or lack of participation across all sectors within Canadian society. First, differing worldviews. Indigenous worldviews are grounded in the belief of an interconnectedness of all things, particularly as it relates to family and community, the human being, and our relationship to all things in the universe. This has been especially true of Indigenous women who have for years leaned towards the human service areas of study, although this trend is gradually changing. Indigenous students often choose educational pathways that focus on community and social factors related to their career choices, whereas other students often consider economic factors within a given career that is most reflective of the current economic sector trends. This may appear to be a very generalized statement. However, it has been my experience that Indigenous students, for the most part, view their educational pathways as not necessarily a career choice, rather an extension of themselves and their responsibilities to family and community. Second, the education system. The education system has historically been incompatible with Indigenous people's worldviews and ways of knowing and being. It has required Indigenous students to sacrifice their cultural identity in order to participate and be successful in higher education. Indigenous education has been chronically underfunded on reserves, and in the public system has all too often streamed Indigenous students away from university-level areas of study, which includes the STEM fields. The good news is, in some places, we are starting to see a shift in the way that Indigenous perspectives and histories are being presented in the school systems. We do have a way to go before these knowledges are fully embraced into the Canadian social and historical narrative, and we still have a way to go before Indigenous students are able to study in schools that acknowledge and embrace the Indigenous contributions to Canada's history and prosperity. The third is residential schools. You all know, or at least have become we have become far more known throughout Canadian society over the past 5 years, the devastating impacts residential schools have had on every aspect of Indigenous society. These impacts still express themselves in all sectors today, especially in the child welfare and justice sectors, and to a large degree, the education system. This in part speaks to my earlier statement that Indigenous students, particularly Indigenous women, tended to lean towards the human service sectors for educational choices. There is a strong sense of community and responsibility amongst Indigenous people, and especially the women of our communities. Today, much the same way residential schools forced Indigenous children to sacrifice their cultural identity just to survive the experience, the current education system often requires them to set aside their Indigenous understanding as human beings from the learning process. Learning, particularly in the STEM disciplines, teaches that science and technology is separate from the human being, rather than a tool that is an expression of, and flows directly out of the human experience. We are, and all things are, connected, and this includes science and technology. Science knows this. However, science is having a very difficult time acknowledging and explaining this fact, even though more and more research is demonstrating this. Yet, this knowledge of interconnectedness of all things in the universe, or Indigenous knowledge, or I would argue human knowledge, is not making its way into the classroom at early stages of learning. Imagine if young girls and boys were taught that everything they are, everything they think, see, eat, breathe, or do is all connected, and that the actions of one has an effect on the other, and that the actions of many has an even greater impact on the planet as a whole. Perhaps then we would see a more evenly balanced gender representation in the STEM fields. Imagine a world where we knew that our words and actions would directly impact our environment and all other life we share on this planet, within this planet. This can be expressed in an Indigenous teaching that states, before you do or say anything, ask yourself how it will impact 7 generations to follow. It is not the first time that we've had this discussion regarding Indigenous peoples or women's participation and success in higher education. RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, was established by an Order of Council in August 26, 1991, and it submitted its report in October 1996. Although RCAP's mandate was to explore all aspects of Indigenous relations with Canada, there was a high emphasis on educational participation and graduation rates, or lack of. That was 22 years ago. At that time, I was a student and participated on one of the student panels or student roundtables. More recently, the TRC, the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was established June 1st, 2008, with a 5-year mandate and was led by Senator Murray Sinclair. The TRC was the most recent discussions around Indigenous peoples' relationship with Canada. First and foremost, the TRC's focus was on the impacts of residential schools, not only on the survivors of the schools, but also on the multi-generational legacy that it has left us with. This includes lower than average participation and graduation rates amongst Indigenous students. Excuse me. However, we have come far from the early days of these discussions when there were literally a handful of Indigenous people in Canada with post-secondary education, and even fewer in the STEM areas of study. Today, we have thousands of lawyers, doctors, teachers, nurses, business owners, and a large young generation who are eager not only to pursue their formal education, but with a renewed sense of cultural pride. When I think of reconciliation, I think as much as the TRC is an important part of the Canadian narrative, what we really also need is a reconciliation of humanity and a reconciliation between humanity and our Mother Earth. So, is there a solution to increasing the participation of Indigenous girls and women in the STEM fields? Perhaps we first must ask, are they already there? Maybe they've always been there. Perhaps we must first recognize and acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have always known of and practice the fundamental concepts of STEM. We have quantum physicists who have always known that all the so-called inanimate objects, such as rocks, are in constant motion at the quantum level and have energy that can be harnessed and used in ceremonies, such as sweat lodges and other things that we use. We have always had chemists and botanists who understood the healing properties and the chemical reactions of combining certain plants for medicinal purposes. We have always had engineers who have built incredible craft and structures that endure to this day. We have always had astrophysicists who have known and understood the celestial cycles of the planets and the accompanying seasons. These people, too, were highly regarded in our communities, and they were called healers, shamans, knowledge keepers, and storytellers. And many of them were and are Indigenous women and girls. This knowledge is as important and valid as current STEM knowledge. It was only expressed in a different way, yet it still recognized and understood the fundamental concepts of current STEM knowledge. Perhaps it is time that Indigenous STEM knowledge took its place next to current knowledge systems. I'm not a good, I don't like reading notes. I like to tell stories, so I was hoping I'd get through my 7 minutes. But I really wanted to emphasize a few points on that, and I could go on. I've been an educator for 25 years, working right from youth at risk right into university level education, and primarily in my time, and not only as a student, but also as a teacher. You know, it's always been the women that have been in the classrooms. That's changing a little bit, but in my time, it was 85–90% of the women and girls were in there. Were in the classrooms and learning in support of our communities, and I think that they are there. I wanted to share with you a little story to kind of put this into context with regards to Indigenous knowledge and STEM knowledge and where it exists, and the education system. Not necessarily that I want to beat down the education system, but the education system, as Senator Marie St. Clair stated, got us in this mess, and it's what's going to get us out. And not just us as Indigenous people, in the STEM fields for everybody, and the way that STEM is taught. At a conference I was at a couple of years ago, there was an astrophysicist doing a presentation from the Perimeter Institute. And in his presentation, he had a little girl, 7 or 8 years old, and she had one of those gaming headbands on. And he asked her he had a computer, laptop, and a projector, and he asked her to think about colored shapes, so green circles, blue squares, that type of thing. So she had her headband on, and this little girl, she's staring at the screen, and she's just concentrating on colored shapes. And then the next thing, a blue circle appeared on the screen. And so everybody was just like, whoa, wow, you know. And I knew exactly what that was when I saw it. And so I, hesitantly put my hand up. I didn't want to, but I asked the astrophysicist, I said, so to put this, and he explained it as a wow moment of technology. This is this great technology that we have today. So I asked him, would it be safe to say in simple terms in explaining this to those of us that don't know the inner workings of all of this, the wonderful technology that we've created today, that device is really just an amplifier? And he paused and he said, yeah. And it didn't seem to me that anybody really grasped what that really meant. And so afterwards I was speaking to him out in the hallway, and I said to him, this is really an amplifier, some technology that is been created through the human being's desire and goals and dreams of creation, And we created that, and it's really just amplifying human ability. And he said, yeah. And I said, well, why don't you tell people that? And he looked at me and he said, well, they wouldn't believe me. They wouldn't believe us. And therein itself lies the problem. And, you know, we can say that with Indigenous girls, women, we can say that with everybody. There lies the problem of power. Knowledge is power, and lack of knowledge is lack of power. And so that's really something that is, Indigenous people have always known this, and I argue humankind has always known this, and it is an extension of human ability and the technology and that we're trying to teach. If we teach it from that perspective, then girls will be more involved. And some things that were said earlier, you know, and I just have to say this about my own, you know, I have kids from 30 to 6, and my little girl loves science, and she loves math. She's 8 years old, right? And she sits and she reads and she does all that inside. My son, who's 6, loves building things, loves robotics and stuff like that. Now, those are two different ways of viewing, male and female ways of viewing those things, but you need them both in order to have this. And our education system, our society has separated those two, our brains right and left, and we've created that environment. We have to nurture and support the two. So in closing, you know, in some of my work, a lot of the work I'm doing now is actually aligning Indigenous knowledge with Western sciences through land-based learning. And I would close by saying, it's my opinion that kids don't lose interest in science and technology, that science and technology loses interest in kids. And so I thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Miigwech.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. You're a very good storyteller. It's true. Welcome, Ms. Beata Crancy. We're very pleased that you have been able to join us, and we do understand how difficult it is to travel in this wonderful season. So Mrs. Crancy is the Chief Economist and Senior Vice President for TD Bank Group. She has written various reports on the challenges and opportunities faced by women in the workplace. She is also dealing with regulation for the TD Bank, which includes representation by the Federal Reserve. She also does analysis of social, macroeconomic and financial issues, such as the volatility of income and Indigenous businesses. For the past 10 years, Mrs. Crancy has undertaken initiatives through the bank on diversity. In 2013, she published a report, Get on Board Corporate Canada, and she played a role in influencing the Ontario Securities Commission's rule amendments on disclosure of women on boards and in senior management. Last year, Ms. Crancy attacked the systemic discrimination against women in various teaching establishments and at the workplace. Her report was called Bridging the Divide, Women in STEM. The floor is now yours.
Inviting me to speak here today. I'm going to review some of the findings of that report that we did last year. I actually did a follow-up report last week as well, because so many parents had reached out after reading about a report on girls and women in STEM that it actually evoked more questions in terms of how they could help bridge that divide for their children. And those questions, by the way, actually extended not just for parents who had daughters, as well for sons, as well as obviously parents are having a difficult time in identifying STEM resources in order to try to get their children ready for this post-digital world. So I broke up my discussion basically into a few categories, pulling from the research of that paper. The first is just a quick review of the economic case for women to be in STEM in increasing numbers. and two, just to review what some of the research is showing in terms of educational and workplace biases that are occurring as friction for women making greater inroads in those areas, and then to review some of the solutions that are starting to come out through various workplaces and educators as they start to identify some of that friction. So starting with the economic case, I probably don't have to make it in this room, but you know, when we looked at the rate of growth of jobs in the STEM field in comparison to other job areas where women have high representation, it was evident that STEM is growing at a rate of 3 times faster than those other sectors. So in terms of employer demand and future growth, this is an area that is not even at its fastest running speed and will certainly be accelerating as we go forward. When you look at the groupings of different types of jobs, we broke out occupations into 36 different types of groupings, and STEM roles are the 3rd highest paying as well. So to be excluded from that really is something that continues to magnify or perpetuate the gender wage gap because they are very high paying and jobs. So for women who are working in STEM relative to areas that they work in high numbers, whether it's in other important areas, social, healthcare, education, the women in STEM will make about 12% more than those other sectors with a university education. But keeping in mind that STEM roles and the digital world goes far beyond needing a university degree. You just need to have high proficiency in the concepts of computer science and math. And so even if you don't have a university degree and you're working in STEM, you're still making a higher wage than if you're working in another area for women as well. So just universally, it's economically or more financially rewarding from that perspective. So naturally, this kind of puts a spotlight on how you can get a perpetuation and a wage gap happening between genders if women continue to make up only about 23% of that workforce in that category because of the higher wages and the rapid growth that's occurring in that working against you over time. So we just did a very simple analysis that if you continue to see the same representation of women in STEM and the full-time, part-time splits in those, that it's not long before you're going to have contributing to a wider and wider wage gap of about 11% over time. So it just continues to drive a wedge in there as we go forward. So that was a very, I think one of the prime motivations for me taking a little bit of a deeper look at this because, I've addressed a gender wage gap in aspects of discussing how motherhood affects women's wages as they go through their career. And this was another one of those little wraparounds as another contributing factor as we go forward, and certainly one that raises that risk. So, as an economist, I think a lot of people think if you're a bank economist, you spend a lot of time forecasting interest rates and foreign exchange rates and things like that. But we actually do at TD pay a lot of attention to social policy because it's very important when you're forecasting out the economy. What does the structure of the economy look like? What does your labor force look like? What's the potential of the growth of that labor force and what's the productive capacity of that labor force? So it's very important that you're optimizing on your workforce for their capabilities and true skill set that's available to them. And when we do out those predictions, it matters. And so we always are mindful if we're seeing a marginalization or underutilization of the workforce. It does affect projections of your trend growth for an economy. And it also heightens the risk of inequality. So as you go forward, if you continue to marginalize large portions of the population or they're not engaging or having equal opportunity in areas that have strong employment growth and strong wage growth, those groups continue to be marginalized and you get this polarization that happens to a greater extent. And so this is why we pay particularly strong attention to them as economists and even in terms of what we're doing from a bank policy perspective. And of course, from your perspective, the greater the risk that people become marginalized in the workforce, the more pressure it puts on government finances to fill the gap either through policies, income supplements, training in the public sector. And not always the best option. It doesn't always, it's almost like you're treating the disease as opposed to the symptom, and we want to be at the front end of it and making sure everybody's highly engaged so you don't end up becoming disenfranchised. So when we first identified the issues on that front, we broke it down into workplace and educational biases that may be occurring. And so I'll start on the workplace side. Basically, you could take your STEM roles, and what we did is we said, okay, there's groupings of roles that are professional, and there's groupings that are technical. So in the computer science world, that would be someone who is a tester of programming as opposed to a software designer. And if you're in engineering, it would be someone who is like a tool designer as opposed to a mechanical robotics engineer. So the technical roles still pay higher than technical roles elsewhere in the economy, but relative to professional roles, they pay lower. So professional and STEM always pay higher than on the technical side. And it's quite stark for women. If you're in a professional role in STEM, full-time for women versus technical, you'll earn about 30 to 37% more by being in the professional side versus the technical side. So again, you have potential for wage disparity between STEM and other, and then even within STEM, you have to be mindful of it when you're doing a review of equal pay. So what we found is what I called in the report hidden occupational sorting, in the sense that when we reviewed the share of women with university degrees in technical roles versus professional within STEM compared to their male counterparts, there was a higher percentage of women with a university degree in technical than we were finding with male counterparts, significantly so. So about 20% of men with university degrees in technical, and women were over the 30%. And so that naturally meant they were going to get the lower wages relative to that representation in the professional side. Now that divergence starts to narrow when they go off and do a master's degree. So what we find is that overwhelmingly when women do a master's degree in a STEM category, that they are more likely to land into professional roles in very high ratios of about 78%. It was still lower than men, but still at a higher ratio than what you were seeing elsewhere. The one anomaly that we found was that within computer science in particular, there was a very high representation of women with master's degrees in technical roles, very disproportionate to what we were seeing in men. About 80% of the women with master's degrees in technical. And then when you flip it, I'm sorry, that's in part-time roles in technical. And when you flip it and you say, well, if you go into professional, do you also see a high representation of masters for women in professional part-time? It was reversed. More men were in the professional part-time roles with the master's, while more women were in the technical part-time roles with the master's degree. So this is why I called it this hidden occupational sorting. If you are in a firm and you're just doing a tick-the-box exercise in terms of do we have 30, 40% representation of women in STEM, if you're not looking at the levels and the roles, it may give you the impression that you have a better representation than you actually do, or it might explain why you have some wage disparity occurring within that firm. So that was an important finding that we put forward in terms of the paper, that we really need to peel the onion a little bit more when we're looking at these statistics. And then we went a little bit step further. So one of the big complaints that firms will often say is that there's a weak pipeline in the educational system. That's well identified. And what we did is we did a little bit of a review and a collection of some of the research out there that might help explain it. And one of the studies I was particularly drawn to was work by Stats Canada using the YITS Youth in Transition Survey that follows young girls and boys through time from the age of 15 to 25. And it looks at their selection choice in careers and compares it to what their aptitudes in math were earlier in life. And what those studies and others by the OECD and others were finding was that your selection in your career choice and educational choice in university was obviously materially influenced by your perception of how you felt you were in those subjects. And what they exposed is that girls who had high aptitude in math, who were scoring in the 95th percentile in PISA in math aptitude scores, were still choosing to follow a STEM field at a lower ratio than boys who scored at the lower end of those same scores. So this was quite interesting to me as an economist, because you just naturally assume that people gravitate to where their strengths were. And so when we looked at other studies, a lot of the issues seem to reside in people's perception, not in terms of what they were actually doing in the classroom, their perception of how they were faring relative to their peers. And so it was fairly universal that girls tend to have a lower perception or self-confidence of themselves in these fields. And so naturally, if this perpetuates through school, you're not going to choose it in university, and you're not going to choose it as a career choice later in life. So there's a self-selection mechanism that's happening very early, which I would presume to suggest that it's, you're likely seeing environmental, educational, and cultural factors. The seeds are germinating rather early on that front. So that was a little bit of a revelation to me, but it did give me a little bit of pause to reflect when I had read through some of those studies that were all pointing in the same direction, because I think for me, when I think back, if I go into a non-academic mode for a moment and relate back to a story, that we often think of, choices that we make in life as a series of choices. It's not just one moment in time. You're building out through your experiences through life. And so one way you could express it is the golden thread, that you have one experience that builds on another and another and another, and it leads to this golden thread that puts you into where you are in your career now or your family choices. And there's a series of positive experiences. I know for myself, one of those golden threads appeared when I was in about grade 9 in math, and where a teacher helped me identify some of my aptitude in that area. And that really stuck with me, and I can go through my life and pick off various points in time where my confidence was built and teachers were recognizing certain skills and abilities in me and promoting those. But that also works in reverse, right? So the golden thread could actually be a tainted thread if you're building on a series of not so positive experiences. And I think that's what a lot of the research was demonstrating that happens very early in life. There was even a Yale study that's showing even at the academic level, at university level, when they did a double-blind test of applicants who were applying for a laboratory manager role, they randomly submitted materials between, assigning genders to the materials, same material. They even found that at the academic levels, professors choosing people in the lab we're still demonstrating a bias towards picking the male applicants over the female identical, offering them more mentoring opportunities as well as higher pay. Now imagine by the time you go through the selection of a STEM educational choice into the career market, your resume may not look as good as your male counterpart because you were not provided those same opportunities in terms of meaningful internships and mentoring. And that's happening even at the level of people who are working in the science field and have an awareness and knowledge of this. So that was one of those telling research journeys for me, having done a cross-section of what was being produced by various researchers as well as international institutions, as well as our own institutions here in Canada. So I'll leave it there. Thank you again for the opportunity to share my comments.
Well, thank you very much to all four of you. You've given us a great amount of your experience and knowledge in this area. 4 excellent presentations and a basis for a number of questions. Our Senate colleagues are on the list, more coming on. I was going to introduce an MP that joined us for a while, but I think she's left. Anyway, I will mention that Jean Yip, who is the Member of Parliament for Scarborough Agincourt, was with us previously, as was Elizabeth May. So, again, I want to remind those I'm facing, our audience, that if you've got any questions or comments, there's a microphone, as you can see right there in the middle. And all you need to do is let Sarah know, and we'll try to work you in as we get along. So the first senator up for a question, Senator Meiji.
I will be asking my question in French. Thank you, Mr. Chair. More than 5 years ago, I was at a school for youth at risk, and I was asked to speak to them to encourage them. But there's a youth who said, well, all right, what you've said, that's all well and good, but I was sent to see my guidance counselor, and he had me fill out a form, and he said, you want to be a doctor, eh? there's a lot of math involved in being in medicine. I'm not sure if that's a good choice for you. You're too gentle. And the girl said, I was always told that I really provide good care, so I'd make a good doctor. Well, the guidance counselor responded by saying, well, be a nurse. And so it just goes against what I was saying to this student. So what do? Shouldn't we also work with guidance counselor, invite them to the summer camps that are held at Concordia, just like we invite the students? Or maybe we should redo the forms and adapt them to the realities of the 21st century. Perhaps these forms were developed a long time ago.
Perhaps Dr. Murphy could answer first.
Merci pour la question. C'est une très...
Thank you very much for your question.
Je vais répondre en français.
I'll answer in French. You have put your finger on an important aspect in our elementary school system, taking away choices from people at a very young age. We have to change the perception of teachers. We have to do away with the stereotyping. That we tend to say math is hard and it's for boys. We have to do this when we're dealing with children at a young age. We have to really review our elementary school system. We have to work with the teachers and with guidance counselors to change their perceptions, because there's a lot of work that's done that shows that guidance counselors do have a tendency to say, well, you're dealing with such and such a community and you should think about working in this field. And that type of guidance is very negative. The parents should also pay attention to this and talk to their children at a very young age. These people almost need to have training to better understand the challenges involved, and so that young girls and young men can pursue the career that they want. Thank you.
Okay.
If I understood your question properly in the beginning, because I didn't listen to that, but based on what he said, I think the question was on how the girls can be introduced in primary schools. So I think the curriculum is very important. The curriculum that is... Sorry?
Guidance counselor?
I think the counselors are very important as a role model for the girls at a younger age, because they are the one who are guiding from the career point of view at a younger age. So they have to be trained. The counselors and also the science teachers have to be trained very well. The image of science and technology and engineering, especially in the books, have to be changed, and the curriculum should be adapted, because usually if you see books, you see a male a guy as an engineer. So that's again another aspect of curriculum change that is important to be introduced.
Okay.
Anybody else? Okay. We'll go on to...
Sénatrice Beauvais.
Sénatrice Beauvais.
I appreciate your perceptions, your facts, and your challenge really to change a wider perception. And I want to talk a little bit about, or ask you about, attracting and retention. I was interested in the material we got in advance of this meeting to see that only 36% of PhDs in science in Canada are earned by women, compared to 49% in the UK. I'm well aware that in the UK, at the, what do they call it, the GCSE level, that higher high school level, they have a series of exams in a special discipline called design technology, in addition to fine arts and in addition to the 3 sciences and in addition to math. And so in terms of encouraging our young women to go into STEM, I wonder if, do we have the appropriate balance of what I might call those connector fields of design technology, which gets these young students into some ways sort of almost pre-engineering, but more from a design perspective than perhaps the math perspective. And then I want to so that's one half of the question about attracting, but then it comes to retention. And I was dealing with a situation last week, it's quite close to me, so I guess I could say it's almost personal, with a young, very recent PhD student, she has her PhD in the STEM field, has applied for postdocs and all, developed her project, which last week was about to be taken over by 2 male academics. And so she spent her last week negotiating the fact that it was her idea, her project, so she felt that she had the rights to it. And I think by the end of the week it was pretty well sorted out. But I have to wonder where generational perceptions come in and what's the difference between systemic concerns and current systems. If we're going to retain our students who have their STEM PhDs in whatever field, there has to be a balance out there for them to be able to continue their work. And I'd be interested in your perception or your thoughts on both the attracting and the retention. And with that, I'm going to ask, where does architecture fit?
Okay, if I can. Okay.
You can go first. Well, you can go first. Okay.
Sure,
I'll take on part of your questions. In terms of the, seeing about 39% of women in PhDs, that's a pretty good number considering there's less of that share happening at the MA and BA level. And so what the research does show is that when you have a woman who completes her bachelor's degree, she is more likely to continue on to pursue postgraduate degrees. And so it tells you that you have a very active educational trajectory there for women. It's really about getting that entry into the BA level, because by extension, that will lead to the higher postgrad work, which leads to the greater career potentials as well. And that is fairly universal. You see it happen in computer science and engineering and elsewhere. It's really getting into the entry of the university level. In terms of how you could push against some of the low numbers and move that dial on that front. One university I was particularly intrigued about, I read it back in 2015, it was actually an important catalyst for the report that I did, was Harvey Mudd out of the US. And that was a school that had only about 12% of women graduating in computer science. The dean, who's Canadian, decided to make a very active change in terms of how they are appealing courses or putting courses forward. Instead of, hey, this is a course about JavaScript, it was a course about problem solving. And so even just changing some of the language and descriptors to make them more appealing to women. But going far beyond that, so knowing that girls from school haven't received in the past the same amount of exposure in these subjects, they created introductory classes so that you would not necessarily have classes dominated by people who've been growing up with working on robotics since they were 7 years old, right? So they allowed for a stream to come in for people who had an interest but maybe not the legacy of the education behind them. And so they created 2 streams, so you're not disadvantaging those who have quite a sophisticated level of knowledge already. And then they also provided opportunities to take the women in those classes over to conferences where they were highly represented by women, so they could see women working in the field, They can identify with computer science roles that are not just about gaming, they're about healthcare and software development and education and other aspects. So they created an arc to the career. And this has also been demonstrated very important for girls in grade school and high school, is to create the arc to the career and not just to teach the subject. So how you teach it becomes extremely important. And I think when you look at that Harvey Mudd and you see a school that took its percentages of women in computer science from 12, 13% to 40% in 4 years, and it's over 50% today, I think we know what the formula is. They put a test model out there for us, and others like Stanford and others are repeating it. It's creating that tangible experience and high exposure very early that can really cause that selection in instead of out into the university level.
Dr. Agarwal?
The connector field, the issue that you raised, I think that's a very important point to incorporate both the aspects of technology, design, and also the visual arts. So in Concordia, we have this joint program where we have visual arts and engineering. So for example, in game development, there is always this digital art connected and how the game is developed. So both aspects are very important in science and technology.
Merci.
Senator Mention.
Senatrice Mention, a little comment. The fact that earlier, I believe that there was the rep from the Concordia University where you said that you took young girls at the end of high school or at CEGEP and you invited them to a STEM camp. That's a great initiative in Ontario since 2013. There's been an initiative of this type, which this was a summer camp for children. So I think that you all mentioned the fact that we have to develop STEM at an interest in STEM at an earlier age and not wait until high school age. Often at high school age, the interests have already been identified. So we have to start earlier. I don't know what you think about associating yourselves with initiatives for children who are quite young. That's one thing. Mr. Morifier, you talked about the education of children, and you said that we had to work with those who taught mathematics or who teach mathematics. I've worked with math all my life. I had only 2 good teachers that really helped me, given the number of teachers I've experienced. 2 is not very much. So the quality of the teaching of math was not very strong. I'd like to hear your comments on the teaching of mathematics and how we can work to improve it. And my third point, university studies. Everything that deals with math training or sectors where math is very important sometimes exclude other people or from courses or programs. And in addition to that, and I think Professor Agarwal talked about this, but do you think the math that we teach in the education curriculum is then used in the work that you do? There are some sectors where we do use this math, but there are other sectors where we don't use the university math once you're on the job market. So I go back to what I said earlier. Math is used to exclude rather than include. I'd like to hear your impressions on that. Who wants to take the risk? Okay, I'll give it a shot. That's a very good question. As I said at the start, if you look at all of the presentations we've given, you can see, as Ms. Caranci pointed out, she talked about discrimination in the area of salaries. Angelique talked about retention, the difficulties in retaining people at the university level. And I talked about a lower educational level. So there's a selection that begins at very early on. So at the start, if we don't have good math teachers, we start losing, students lose confidence. And as they go along, but since a young person is starting to lose confidence in math, this person decides not to go into math. The student says, my preference is to go in another sector because I don't have strong math skills. So I think that the problem, if we really analyze it, you have to look at all levels. At the primary level, we have to look at the math curriculum and try to rethink the way we teach math. There are various levels of math, but there's math that's applicable to research, there's math that's applicable to other sectors. So we have to really look at the way we train teachers at all levels so that we can develop a curriculum that will teach useful math for all sectors, for everybody, and make them show that math is something that everybody can learn. We can ask parents and teachers. We ask these parents, do you think children can learn to read? And they'll say yes. But how about math? Often they say no, because we have this impression that math is innate, which is not true. So we have to demystify that and show that work needs to be done at this level. We have to improve our curriculum, create this desire to study math. And we have to introduce this at an earlier age. And when a student gets to the level where at a point where people are no longer afraid of math, well, then it would be easier. But I think that at the university level, such as the University of Toronto, generally speaking, people want to study math because math is not just one way of doing things that are difficult, but it's about, we have to understand, it's not all about math marks, but we have to start with young people at an early age. I agree. We have to look at the way we teach math so that we will make math more available to everybody. And that ties into the comments made by others about this complex of superiority we see at the math level. A lot of people brag that they're very strong in math, and so I'm better than others. That's not a good way to approach things. I think there's a lot of work to be done at that level. Thank you. Mr. Caucus.
Way into some areas that may be out of my areas of so-called expertise, but these really touch on things that in Indigenous communities we've been talking about exactly this for as long as I can remember, and I'm sure Senator Dick understands this. But when we talk about like recruitment, retention, teachers having difficulty, and particularly math, which I'll kind of touch on here, and the piece on STEM camps and getting to kids early. We do a lot of STEM camps that are design based with younger kids to get them interested just in conceptual stuff. And they love it, right? But the word that's used in Indigenous education is transitional programming, right? And everybody talks about transitional programming, but it doesn't, as far as I can tell, I haven't been able to come across really good wraparound transitional programming. That's what I've been spending my life on, is creating programming that is transitional from, 3 or 4 years old to PhDs, right? And that's ongoing support, all of the things that we've talked about, Indigenous education since the beginning of time, as far as guiding our youth, our children through the education process at every level, not siloed from junior, intermediate. We have to create programming educators, teachers that understand that and do that. And STEM camps is really where it happens, and they're fun. And that's the point where kids are still loving science, right? The teachers, there's a big, in my work, I work with 37 universities, undergrad students who work with teachers right across the country. Right across the country, teachers are in a bit of a panic about how to deliver this new content, this digital skills, this digital literacy content, this new technological content. As a former educator, I remember when I went in, and in those days they used overheads and slides, and they handed me the stuff and they said, teach, right? Now, I didn't have a teaching background, but there it was, teach. And so within a year, I said, no, I'm not going to regurgitate curriculum, right? We have to, and that's part of the teacher, and I've worked at teachers' colleges. Teacher training is regurgitation of content, right? There's no experiential knowledge based in that content, which leads me to the math. I've talked to a lot of aspiring physicists, aspiring astrophysicists, mathematicians. Most of them, this is second, third year people, often don't know about Fibonacci, the Fibonacci sequence. And I'm saying, and I as not being a scientist, I just learned about it myself 5 years ago, 6 years ago, as I started looking at Western approaches to science, technology, and engineering, and aligning that with Indigenous knowledges. And Fibonacci is the natural first starting point at an early age for patterns and numerology and numbers, and that should be woven through the whole system. They should never forget about the Fibonacci sequence and how that relates to the natural world and everything around us. Everything evolves out of that. And then there's relevance in the mathematics. Then mathematics becomes relevant to the learning process. And I think that's what I've experienced is through the whole education system. There's no relevance. At certain points, we lose connection to it having any meaning to me. And there's all kinds of great programs out there that are using mathematics and Indigenous knowledge of the land to bring the two together. Egyptian math. Nobody talks about Egyptian math. That's binary code that is feeding our existing math technologies. We're not teaching that as an easy way to do it. So, yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay.
I just want to add on math. Math is, of course, very important at every stage of life. It helps us to develop our brain logically and understand the things in a different way, and helps us to solve problems. So the skills are developed. So it's very important in every stage of life. And it's not that you learn math and you don't apply it. You apply it at every stage of life in problem solving.
Okay, we got 27 minutes left. I've got Senator Dick, Senator Galvez, Senator Cordy, Senator Dupuy, plus 4 from the audience. So I'll take a couple now from the audience, and then we'll go back to senators and work in the other 2. But we're going to have to pick up the pace, both in questions and in answers, to get through in 27 minutes. First question I have, the person actually isn't here. The question came by email. And it came from Edmonton, Alberta, and it comes from a 9-year-old girl by the name of Sophia. So she's a young entrepreneur, an advocate for girls in STEM, and as I said, at only 9 years of age, she has founded Startup by Sophia. I actually checked it out on the website. You can check it out, Startup by Sophia, which is an organization that creates chemistry, physics, and biology-based products to help educate, inspire, and provide leadership to other children in STEM. Sophia, unfortunately, can't join us today, although I understand somebody in our audience is associated with her, but I haven't got the piece of paper. So she's sent in this question by email. So I quote, "There are a lot of wonderful people and organizations doing camps and things to get girls and women into STEM. STEM is bigger than just a camp. There are STEM innovators like me and that are leading the way to real companies and making a real impact. You need us as role models, and we need you to remove barriers because we need the help. What can leaders like me," and she mentioned some other names, Hannah, Lauren, Ashley, and Caitlin, I take it are young ladies associated with her, "do to help you? What can you do to help us?" She says, "I will give you a hint. Reach out to us because the decision makers, school, parents, and kids need examples." End of quote. Panel. That's from Sophia. Responses?
Okay.
She answered.
She answered it. You agree with everything she says?
That's exactly
I think she is very lucky to have parents who are supporting her, and in all the areas that she is doing, and in starting up companies and doing whatever she has. So she is a very good support from her parents and also school teachers, I guess.
I think the most important thing, though, that she says there, and it's kind of been said here, when you have kids, 3 or 4 of them are excelling and they want a next step opportunity, and we fail them in the education system and socially to create that net. We keep them in grade 3. We keep them all in grade 4. Within that group, there's always 2 or 3. And that's how I build my programs, is I find those 2 or 3 and create next step opportunities, because they're moving and they're the ones that are ready. And I watched her website. She's ready.
I would like to add something, because what she said was very interesting. I have been working to see all the type of solutions that may affect and increase this enrollment in the STEM. And one of the things was that I look at a lot was the lack of role model. So if you look at the university professor, for example, in different STEM fields, the rate in engineering, in mathematics is very low in general. So some of the department of the university try to improve, like at University of Toronto recently that we are trying. But I never thought about actually having a role models amongst the youngest. So I always thought of like having like very successful women that come to talk with those young girls. But what she says is very interesting, because in general, many research show that usually kids tend to be more affected by their peers. Yeah. So seeing this type of young girls that come to their school to say that, okay, I'm a young girl, Sophia, 9 years old, I was able to build something like in the STEM, would be a very good signal for this. And we have to make advantage of that, I think. We have to take a look of more young role model and try to make them appear in front of their peers, to try to give more role model for them. Thank you.
If I could just add one last thing, the notion of the camps. We've got a secondary educational system that's formed outside of the public system. And I think as policymakers, we have to be mindful that if there is a perceived educational deficit occurring in terms of teaching models, we may be creating the ecosystem for inequality because those who have parents with knowledge, those who have parents with means, get to go to the camps and get to have this curiosity and this interest flourish. And if you don't have that same accessibility, you don't. And if your school isn't your first touch point, where do you go? And so I think this is wonderful for her, and she's doing exactly what she should be doing in terms of being out there, being a role model and teaching others, which is very important from the peer-to-peer. But I think as policymakers, we have to think about why parents are increasingly seeking to educate their children through summer camps, after-school programs, more and more in these areas, coding, robotics, outside of the school system, formal. And we have to think about what that means for lower-income individuals.
Okay, so those are the answers for Sophia. We also have in our audience, and I ask her to come to the microphone, Fatima Remtula, I believe it is. She's an independent consultant. And question or comment? Got 3 minutes.
Yes, my name is Fatima Remtula. I'm a gender equality independent consultant. I met Sophia and Lauren and some of the girls and boys that are mentioned in that comment at the Gender Equality Forum, which was sponsored by the Canada Global Compact, Network Compact, the UN Network Compact, and the UN Women last year in April of 2017. Since then, we have been working through Sophia's parents and Lauren's parents to get the girls out there. The vision that the girls have is, one, Sophia wants to be an entrepreneur that will one day be an innovator whose product is of an equivalent of the Canadarm up in space, or something that is making a difference out there in the world. She is presently involved in the public school system. Lauren, who is 12 years old, is not presently in the public school system, is now at her homestay school system, mainly because the school system is not supporting her intellectuality and her curiosity. She has a dream of becoming an astronaut that will one day represent Canada up in the space in one of the missions. Both the girls are very involved, hands-on, in getting their projects going, in creating their projects, but a lot of times hit stumbling blocks when it comes to science fairs, where they're told each year you're supposed to come up with a new project. So what this ends up being is that we end up having to create again a new project and not being able to follow through with the projects that we already are working on hand. Secondly, there's a huge gap for them where they're trying to innovate and focus on putting their actual skills and tools and creating the actual products, but then it also becomes a manufacturing and getting it out into the market. So there's a gap that we are seeing in how we can follow through with this whole process. And I'm sure the educators also in this room might already know of is that at the university level, at the college levels, we get the funding from governments to give us the funding to do research and projects. But a lot of times those projects don't get carried through into the market because we don't have that continuity of connecting it with business. And I bring this forward mainly because Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030 actually asks us to work interconnectedly in bringing those forward. So with those, I hope that I'm representing the girls here. Thank you for your time and your listening.
Thank you very much. That's a great follow-up to Sophia's question. Any comments, panelists, further? Okay, let me try to sneak in. I've only got one more audience, and let me try to sneak this in. Richard Senyuk, I guess it is. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong.
Richard Senyuk.
Senyuk, sorry.
I'm a retired teacher. I taught here in Ottawa. I taught computer programming, mathematics, and computer technology. I fell into being the mentor for the Glebe Collegiate Robotics team for 14 years. After I retired, I started my own after-school and summer camps in robotics, and I'm now the Canadian support competition coordinator or person for the VEX robotics competitions. I come to you as a way to involve students in STEM. And actually in robotics, we now call it STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. And that's the new buzzword. In the States, VEX Robotics is headquartered in Texas, and they have associated the Robotics Education and Competition Foundation every year at the World Championships it travels around the States. The last 3 years it's been in Louisville, Kentucky. And 4 years ago it was in Anaheim, California. I have gone and volunteered at that, and I can tell you that the push in STEM and in robotics and girls' teams is one way of getting girls, or young ladies, involved in STEM. VEX has a Girl Power initiative where every year they promote the International Day of the the Girl, and October 11th, 2018 is the next one. They have camps and seminars for girls all day where they invite role models in to speak to them. And it was worked very well in Canada this year. I think we had 4 or 5. We're hoping to increase it. And the robotics program, there's many robotics programs out there promoting STEM. First Robotics, started by Dean Kamen, the inventor of the Segway. He called robotics the sporting competition for the nerds. And they involve them. Unfortunately, First Robotics, the big competition, is only for high schools. VEX Robotics has a platform for students in grades 2 to 8, and then 9 to 12 and university. And the big problem we have is getting the students involved and getting kits out to the students. So if there's some way that it can be found to help get schools involved, and in Canada the distances between schools and school districts to have these competition going is very hard. I mean, Ontario, British Columbia is very big in robotics programs, and they're just fantastic programs. You see kids build robots that I don't know where they came up with the ideas. And and it's something that students are involved in, and you get to see. They have to design them. They have to know what they are, and you know how the gears all work, and everything that happens in that. Quick example, and I'll sit down, is some of my camps, we build, the younger kids I build, and I start in grade 2, they built a simple robot, and one of their first things is to measure how far it goes with one revolution or one rotation of the wheel. And then it goes 20 centimeters, so you ask them, well, how many rotations that wheel go in? Have to go 60, they say 3. And then you say, well, what about 70 centimeters? And they look at you and go, that's math. No, it's math, not math, it's fun. And they get the answers. So, you know, we have to get them involved at a young age. You can't wait till the high schools. That's too late, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Ça rejoint un message.
Thank you very much. That's a message that I would be pleased to deliver. Senator Dick.
I'm sorry that Senator Galvez had to leave. She and I are both scientists, and we've gone through the system. I found today's talks really, really interesting. I was sort of like a flashback of my whole life, you know, all the things that have happened since grade school to arriving in the Senate. And we're talking about the barriers and so on of getting, how do we attract women into science and girls? How do we recruit them into universities? How do we retain them in the schools, in the workplace? And how do we promote them so that they become equally promoted as the men? And then, of course, then there are cultural aspects, because in Canada, of course, now we are now starting programs to actively recruit Indigenous students into the classroom. And I believe that both girls and women bring extra value. And it's now beginning to recognize that there is extra value, but there are also those weeding classes or exit points. And Senator Motion took my question with regard to calculus, because when I was the Associate Dean at University of Saskatchewan, we identified very clearly that calculus was a weeder course. And I don't know if anyone has ever done anything to change that, because the culture of the math department was that you're a good department if you fail as many students as you can. Well, you're setting people up for failure as opposed to setting people up for excellence. and I guess really what my question is with regard to culture. How do you recognize the value that women or Indigenous people bring to science when you're faced with the primarily teachers and professors who are white male? So how do we bridge that cultural divide? There are some programs, especially for youth, the summer camps and so on, which have been going now for decades, since the 70s, that are productive. But my concern is at the university level. How do we change it so that the faculty of the universities then represent the diversity of the country?
And that kind of alludes to what I was saying about teachers and even at the university level right now. Part of what we're doing in the work in my work is teacher AQs, right, that are based in Indigenous, aligning Indigenous or being aware of Indigenous ways of knowing that align with Indigenous or with Western STEM. I mean, it's in the school system. School systems are becoming more aware of Indigenous knowledge and culture in the school systems, but from a science standpoint, it's two different lenses, completely two different lenses, right? So a lot of my work has been focused on that, working with faculty, people at the university and high school level to go on the land, and I've developed a what's called an aspects of cultures matrix, where really, and it's aligned with the curriculum, the Ministry of, and we're doing it all across the country, BC, Ontario, but the Ministry's curriculum. So, you know, all of their curriculum lining up with science courses with that aspects of culture locally, so that teachers have an opportunity through an AQ. We're working on the AQs now. AQ? Additional qualifications for teachers, right? And then following the BA, Masters, you know, track into university, hopefully, right, and involving, you know, the university. So our programs are basically with faculties, in faculties of sciences, engineering faculties, engaging them in that.
Anyone else on that question of how you change the culture?
The culture in university is, of course, more male-oriented, specifically in science and engineering. As we noticed, the women faculty is not as many. So I think we need, of course, some role models there. And the program that we had, the Girls Said, the summer program that we had, the main thing that I wanted to focus also was role models as counselors. So all the counselors for the summer camp were female students, current undergrad students, current graduate students, master's, PhD students, who were offering the help to the students. So I think that's very important to have more participation from women.
I'll just say, in the economics field, which has a very strong math base, I went through all my undergrad and my master's degree. I did a double major in economics at U of T and then a master's at Laurier, and I had a sum total of one female professor throughout what was a 6-year educational career. So, you know, I think we need to hold our educational system as accountable as we do with corporations to make sure that they are putting forward diverse candidate slates in front of, you know, opportunities when teaching opportunities come forward, as well as that they have proper representation. I'm not sure if that's to what degree that occurs. I don't have that line of sight. But I think there should be some measurable results placed against the educational system on this front.
Dr. Murphy?
I totally agree. I think the representativity of different, I think, women and also some particular race among the faculty are very important. Right? For example, I have been in the U of T faculty member amongst this African, you know, people with African background. We are not that much, you know, and this seems to affect our, you know, African people who are African background in terms of not seeing that much representativity. And this, I think, happened for all the minorities. And then we have to work on that to bring more role model. because this shaped the mind of the kid at a very early age, I think. And this, I think we have to start with more indigenous people in very different level of education, more women at very different level of education, and more diversity types of everywhere, as you start by saying the Michelle Obama saying about this. So the representativity, I think, is the key, and you need to have this everywhere, I think.
Any further questions, colleagues? Senator Joyal.
Apologize to be late, Madame la Co-Présidente et Monsieur le Président. I think what's involved here, it's a cultural shift, you know. From the early school, you know, the first grade, the role model that are presented to the kids are the traditional role model where the woman takes care of the kids and the guys, you know, fight, you know, the enemy. And the overall cultural model that are vehicle through TV, through those video games, to everything, you know, the women is still depicted in a traditional way. You know, pink is for girl, which is soft, and blue is for guy, you know, affirmative. So I think that as much as the role model of achiever, you know, like we had with the present Governor General and some other high-profile Canadian women who have achieved a career and have left their mark in the fields of mathematics, physics, and so forth. Nevertheless, at the basic of society, we have to be very mindful that there are other trends that pull people in the other direction. And that is not only in the school, it's in the overall society environment. Because the role model vehicle, as I said, by technology, by internet now and everything, is where the minds of people are, you know, get to fix on what is their aspiration, to who they identify. So I think it is a very, important shift that our system has to operate if we really want to achieve that, you know, balance and parity of women representation, where they have, all the chances to succeed. When, as you are yourself, and a good example of that. But you fight against, I should say, the fixity of a system that doesn't support that way for girls and women to say, here's my future, as much there as, taking care of kids in a summer school or other jobs whereby we have always seen the women. And we're still fighting against what I call the weight of a patriarchal society. And that has some impact in the way that we see the future and the role model. And I think this is a fight that is broad. And I think as much as what you do is helpful, I think we have to be very conscious the height of the mountain we have to climb on, to see the future.
Well, those are good words to end our meeting on. You've done a great service to us by informing us of your knowledge of this field, and I've learned a lot. I'm sure my colleagues have as well today. So I thank all four of you who are panelists, and keep moving things along. Sophia is watching, so she wants to make sure that things are moving along, and so thank you for being here. And any closing comments?
Je dirais que
I would say that you have given us much food for thought. We need to follow up, looking at our public policy, looking at the way we harmonize federal and provincial policies. And perhaps this could be the subject of our committee work or a special study by the Senate. So I'd like to thank our panelists, and I'd like to thank the members of our audience especially for interesting questions put forward by men and women. So thank you very much. Senator Munson.
Comment. I wasn't here for the whole session, but I want to engage with, for 30 seconds, with the audience that I was upstairs. We have a Senate engagement program, so I was talking to grade 7 students at this new school called Pioneer School, and I told them, I'm in a learning curve myself downstairs, talking to you folks and listening to you folks, and there were 6 young women out of the 19 students in grade 6, grade 7, and I said, I'm trying to get around with this. I said, but does anybody here know what STEM is? 6 hands went up, and all these grade 7 students told me, don't you know, Senator, it's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics? And they're grade 6 and grade 7. I said, boy, this day is a really learning day for me. I said, I'm trying to combine both here, because I'll get a transcript of this, but I was being taught to them. And then they came to me and said, well, would you like to know more? I said, so that's why I was a little late on the thing. So with a father of 2 sons, I'm really excited to get into, to understand this. But just to tell you what, they grade 6 and grade 7, they know a lot more than we think they do.
Good start.
Yeah, so thank you.
That's a good start. Let's. Okay, and with that, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you. Très intéressant.